Welcome to Raven Talk, the official podcast of the Raven Tribe. The Raven Tribe is a home for warriors on the path, and is dedicated to training warriors for the battlefield of life. Visit us on the web at theraventribe.com, where you can learn more information on membership, warrior training, as well as links to our official YouTube channel, Facebook group, apparel store, and our official bookstore, Marshall Books.
Good afternoon, Tribe. This is Hanjiro stepping in to do the intro for this beginning in a series that we'll be doing. A long time ago, I was in school and doing some master's thesis on warrior culture and all of the variables within it. So this would logically be called Variables of the Human Condition within Warrior Culture. And then within that, we'll have a bunch of different things. The first being this one about homosexuality or sexual orientation within warrior culture. Specifically, it's not so much about martial arts, but what we in the Raven Tribe, Mr. Vargas and myself, try to do is build a culture, build a tribe. And so it's different than just being considerate of just a martial art. But it's the tribe. And that changes two things. One, martial art of its own will be a very specific kind of culture that it comes from, a specific kind of mindset maybe, but definitely a smaller demographic and smaller view of these things. And so the tribe is multicultural, multi-demographic, multi-ethnic, all of these other things. So it changes how we look at this and how we think about it. And so this being the first part in a multi-part series, then we'll have all of these different variables of, as we said, the human condition, who we are as human beings, all these small things that we bring to the group. So the first, as I said, being homosexuality or sexual orientation within warrior culture. So warrior culture being something that's culturally based within a society that has the warrior aspect to it. So great example, and we'll be using historical examples within this, is Spartan culture. I did a lot of study on this. I had a very good friend who was a classics major who did a lot of translations. Much of Spartan culture has been expressed in movies differently, in books differently, but really, the movie 300, just, a decade ago, was the first big one that came out. And I saw a lot of parallels between representation of Japanese culture, like through samurai movies and that kind of stuff, and through the reality of Spartan culture, and then this movie 300, which was supposedly about the one incident between the Spartans and the Persians at a specific battle, Thermopylae, but there was some cultural background, something to make the antagonist and protagonist, these two warring cultures, more black and white. And one thing was the Spartans were to say of the Athenians, the other Greeks that were allying themselves in this fight against the big bad Persians, that they were, I remember one character calling the other Athenian a boy lover, which alludes to homosexuality within the culture, but it doesn't express that the Spartans themselves had a culture of institutionalized, called pederasty, which means essentially institutionalized homosexuality through the military and culture. That is not unusual. The structure of how it happens is not unusual. It's just different. Native Americans have not so much based in a warrior culture, but they have within their own society, as has been explained by a friend of mine, effeminate males or masculine or dominant females, assuming gender in specific roles. And that is not how it was in a militaristic society or a warrior-based culture. Like, in my understanding, what I know best will be the Japanese culture, specifically of the samurai and hierarchical Japan, and then through the Spartans, through research that I have directly been a part of. References to this. As far as the Spartans, I would say is the most well-defined and the best explained. I would recommend a couple of books, one of them by Paul Cartledge. I believe that's the correct pronunciation of his last name. Quite simply called The Spartans. You can get it on audiobook as well. There's another one that he does about Thermopylae, but he just references a lot of the other book, and that would be a great book, even an audiobook. It's well read by I think a gentleman by the last name of Mr. Lee does a very good job reading it, but it does great explanation on how this fits into Spartan society. Not so much exactly where it came from, but how it fits into the warrior culture. Now, again, back to the Raven tribe, we're looking at this as just one piece of where we are today. All of human history lines up to where we are now. Like all of our forefathers gave birth to us, and we are continuing the timeline, and our children will carry on after us. And one of the things that makes us human is our sexuality, obviously, among other things. And within warrior culture, sometimes this affects warrior culture, sexuality. Sometimes it does not. Sometimes, like in our current military and warrior culture, we're grappling with what does that mean. We're looking at different gender roles and identities, and like women serving in different places within the military, sexual identification, all these kind of things are wrapped up in the idea of how does this fit into warrior culture. Within the Japanese and Spartan both societies, it seems as though less of less of the military needs or military doctrine is influenced by and influences this idea of sexuality or gender identity. You had gender identity within the Spartans where women, upon marriage, shaved their heads. They were not subservient to their husbands by any means, but the men grew their hair long and the women shaved their heads is the biggest physical change upon marriage. But socially, women of Spartan men who were only allowed one kind of occupation, which was to be a soldier. It was a different society than ours. It takes a little bit of explanation here. Spartan society was hierarchical, and it was a slave-based society because all Spartan males, citizens, that were Spartan only, were soldiers. So all of the food production, all of the other trades, anything that wasn't directly being a soldier were done by lower classes or slaves of different ethnic or social backgrounds. That needs to be said. So the idea, and Paul Cartledge does a great job of explaining this, is you have these fraternities of men who are all soldiers, and they all serve in the military, they all defend their state, and they all have wives at some point, be it older or younger ages. But there is this institutionalized idea of, and I call it the hearer and the listener. And the hearer, or the person who hears the lessons and teaches, and then the other person, the listener, is the one who takes the lessons. Now, this is in a social, this is in a militaristic, and then this is also in the sexual reference between males. So there would be an older male, and he would be the hearer, the one who hears, the divine word or the word of education and passes this on to the other, who would be the listener, the person who listens to this. This was not always a homosexual relationship within the Spartan military, but it was very often called this in reference to that relationship. Spartan society, how did they look upon this? Was it taboo? Was it something that just wasn't talked about? We don't exactly know, but it was so widespread, and we know that because this happened all across the military for hundreds of years, it was something that was probably not even just tolerated, but, and this is where the term institutionalized pederasty gets used in this, that it was a part of the military and warrior culture of that time. again, for really in-depth, go and check out the book, The Spartans by Paul Cartledge, and check it out. It's a very good explanation of that. Contrast that. So that is a military state that mandates all of its men of that class be in the military, and that is all that they do. Then you go to Japan, and Japanese culture had changed a lot. Spartan culture, I'm sure, has changed. We're focusing on one time, which would be from the zenith of Spartan culture and military culture. Now we're going over to Japan, and we're looking at a longer time continuum. So in Sparta, we're looking at about 300 or 400 years. So say the very late 4th century BCE up until almost the 1st century. Japan will look at a little bit later, closer to the Edo period. Japan has a very different history. Definitely look into understanding the different times of Japanese history, because there was great social and militaristic change, and that affected the society, and that affected the martial arts, and that affected the people, obviously. So, in brief, and again, look at more to explain this, Japan goes from being a very fragmented society of warring states to a somewhat joined society of fewer states that were fighting under stronger warlords, and then to a unified country under a military dictatorship. Again, similarly, you have bands of men who are expected socially at the high social orders to be samurai or heads of household, per se, or knights who control lands or have status. Within these, it is not a part of each individual military or military unit or battle formation to have, like the Spartans did, a class and military-wide understanding that you have this relationship where you have a senior and a junior person, and a big portion of those people would have had some kind of homosexual relationship as a part of the military relationship or the apprenticeship, per se. That wasn't as well documented. It wasn't as universally prevalent as, say, within Spartan military culture, but some of that has to do with the simple fragmentation of the culture. We're dealing with a larger society. We're dealing with a larger, not a city-state like Sparta, but an entire country. Smaller areas broken up, whereas Sparta was, again, a smaller area, but it didn't have further divisions within inside of it militarily, and Japan did. So this changes things. Socially, in most of Japanese culture, homosexuality was known, and it was not propagated. It wasn't said that everyone should do this. Sexual orientation and that kind of stuff wasn't a forefront issue, but it was something that could affect you, just in our current society where people feel negatively or positively affected by their gender or sexual identity specifically. In Japan, that wasn't the case, but again, there are so many different instances. We'll look at the early to mid-Edo, that would be around the 1700s. We'll focus within, say, 1700 to 1790. There's a lot of military movement and things that happen at that time. Guns and regimented military units are more concentrated, and then you have a larger portion of the samurai population which become disenfranchised. They don't have land anymore. They don't have military or economic backing, and so they're out in the town. So you have ronin, or master of the samurai, or samurai who don't have estates that they base their wealth on, but they have other things such as either manual labor or labor for, like, bodyguard labor, guard labor, working for merchants, scribes, because they would have been, with the early education, taught how to read and write, all of these things. So you have a class of men who know how to fight. They know military structure a little bit. They would have been educated from a young age, much like the Spartans, but the end result is different. The land is different, the economics are different, and so you have a leisure class for a lesser term. I don't know a better term for it that would be all-encompassing in English. So the samurai have the idea of flexible identity, and so you don't have it institutionalized, but you do have it existing. And like I said before, it wasn't pushed one way or the other. It just was something in existence, and it's socially, even today, a little bit more fluid than we often see here in America until fairly recently. But the idea is you do see institutions that ban, or not ban, but they restrict rights of women. They completely eliminate rights of minorities. That's another aspect that we'll deal with it in another episode. But just looking at kabuki. So kabuki is Japanese theater, much like opera. It incorporates elements of martial arts, of singing, dance, all that kind of stuff. However, all females were portrayed by males, just like in Shakespeare's time. All of his actors were males, even the female parts. There is a great amount of documentation of individuals and their life, and they became very famous actors. Their lives are well documented. There's even tax records of two specifically within Tokyo that had numerous businesses that they were funding that ran afoul of the government, and it's a pretty interesting story into itself. But these people, these actors, had lifestyles that were not too different than what we have with our actors and actresses today. The difference is just in technology. You didn't have instantaneous, Facebook and all that kind of stuff, obviously, but you had these woodblock prints. You had these paper prints and these word of mouth that would go out. And just like the telephone game, history gets changed that way. But you had actors who played females but were males, and vice versa. You had males who were very effeminate but still were not seen as being anything less than because they were. And within fights, it was, for the time, fights and duels were very well documented within specific individuals. One of them would be a man in southern Japan who was quite small at the time that this was documented. Hiroyuki Nakadai is a well-known actor as well within samurai movies. Similar thing, he was a kind of a smaller guy, and he always played roles that were played on that he was very small and kind of effeminate looking, but he was the guy who always had the crazy fast sword, or he was the guy with the gun when everybody else had a sword. So that identity of the weaker being still the stronger in some way is something that's very common in Japanese culture. Now, where do we take all of this history and all of this kind of social information, and how does that relate to the tribe? Well, Mr. Vargas and I talk a lot about all of these issues when we think about how do we include a tribe? How are we inclusive? We don't agree with everybody. We don't agree with everything. And I think I'm the one who's a little bit more standoffish than Mr. Vargas. But there are things about people that we just accept as are, and that we don't either need to, perpetuate or promote, I guess? Yeah, promote. But accept that that is a part of the person. And this would be something that if a single culture was a bigger part of the tribe, there may be issues. If it was that language and society was a bigger part of the tribe, there may be an issue. But ultimately, Xenophon, older Greek writer, and other Greeks and Romans have echoed almost the same philosophy that was said by a Roman later on. I can't remember his name. I will, and I'd like to put it in some notes. The warrior arts are the arts of Mars, so the martial arts are the arts of Mars, the god, and the arts of love are those of Eros, and they do not exist in the same sky at the same time. So in that idea, it's that if you're training for war, then that is one thing. If you're in the world of love, that is a complete other, and that they don't exist at the same time. It's not to say that they don't exist within the same person, but they're just not at the same time. And the Romans, the Japanese samurai specifically, and the Spartans especially, were all very keen to explain that as soldiers, they are professionals. And everything from dealing with physical discomfort to social issues to absolutely anything that would affect your ability to function as a soldier is secondary. And the first thing at the time that you have a sword in your hand, as Musashi puts it, is your intent in cutting down your opponent. So just as we say, all of those things may exist, but they're immaterial, concerned with the larger issue, and that is that we learn from each other, we learn together, and we learn with the direction of making all of ourselves better. If there's more to add to this, I'm sure Mr. Vargas will chime in. He may add on to this.
Hanjudo, let me ask you, because this brings up a lot of questions. The homosexual orientation in these highly militarized cultures, was there any conscious purpose to it other than just natural sexuality? I mean, I've read in some places where it suggested that it was even encouraged to form bonds between the soldiers. Is there any truth to that in your research?
It's very sporadic, and there's no direct correlation. It's not as to say, by direct correlation, I mean, we haven't found a military code written down somewhere saying that there is going to be this kind of relationship between soldiers. That's just not done. I don't think that when it comes to, like, soldiers are not told where to go to the bathroom. Soldiers are not told how and what and when to eat. Like, these are basic physical functions that are not explained by large-scale military doctrine. They're just kind of, you figure it out. However, it's been postulated by a lot of very reputable people that, yes, it was, like you said, something that was not dissuaded, not told no, but something that was not also enforced. There were things like within Spartan culture, women were not said to be inferior than men, but they were different than men. They could hold land, they could control things, finances and such as well, and they had their own part in the Olympics. They trained, naked and ran around just like the men did, and with weapons, and were just as brutal in their education sometimes. But women served separately than men, just like in other Greek and even in the Roman times. Romans were a little different, but women fought separately from men in different regiments or did different things. And within Japanese warrior culture as well, there were women that were trained in different things. The biggest variable that changes how and why women and men serve either together or separately is by social convention. Like, the Israelis have no problem with putting women and men in trenches together, and women have compulsory military service right alongside men. But in the U.S., we have separate issues of this. And from my observation, it's just social constraint that really makes that. As far as what you said about doctrine, is it said to do this? We don't know. But there's great evidence to suggest that, like you said, in order to forge bonds between men, that these things evolved. But again, there's no absolute written doctrine that we have.
Hanjudo, let me ask you, and again, this is not to liken warriors to prisoners, but we see in modern times, especially in our prison system, jail systems, that there is a proclivity to homosexual behavior when you have people
that are, cut off from the opposite sex. Also, you can argue that it's a very masculine, in the prison system, male prison is a very masculine environment, kind of hyper masculinity going on. Do you think that there is any, correlation to that type of, social environment between, the ancient soldiers and, an example, like I said, of people in modern day prisons?
That's a good question, and there's a couple of things attached to that, but just straight on, yes and no. Never that easy. There's always going to be, when you lock a group of people together, there's always going to be sharing, be it emotional, physical, otherwise. It doesn't matter what they are. You could lock 10 different people of 10 different backgrounds who, even if you were to get 10 different backgrounds that hate each other, by the end of a time sequestered together, they will have shared more than anything. That's just who we are as human beings. So go to the male and female aspect of this. If you lock away 10 males, will there be that kind of sharing? Quite possibly. Put them in a stressful situation like military service where you're surrounded by stress, you forge bonds of protection of each other and support of each other. Would there be those things that happen? Yes. Now, the difference with this is that we're looking at sexual orientation, which is very huge. It's multifaceted. There are people who have huge degrees and bigger things to their name than little old me who have better understanding of this. But in prisons, I've had the opportunity to be the guest of Cook County Correctional a couple of times. Oftentimes, sex is almost a weapon, and that's the thing with sexual crime and all of these things. Sex is viewed as a weapon, as a means of dominance. That's not something that is, at least in the Spartan research that I've seen and read, and there's 3 or 4 great books that mention this kind of thing, but the one that I said earlier is the best one to go to. It's not a means of dominance, and it's not a means of just a bond, but that is explained. Yes, it is to forge that bond, and they do exclude women, so that happens, but there isn't that idea of violence or, pushing something on another individual. So your question doesn't have an easy, neat answer because we're dealing with human sexuality and there's a lot to it.
Hanjito, let me ask you, what do you think that this, research will do in the sense that it may, broaden some perspective on some, biases that people in the tribe may hold today? We've all kind of grown up in a culture where, you're a sissy if you happen to be homosexual. And of course, you can't be an effective warrior. You can't, be considered on the same level as a real man, that likes women. And it's that kind of mentality that we often, bump into, even with the most enlightened of people. There's still a lot of stereotypes and there are a lot of prejudices. I think that from my perspective, at least from the sense of warriorship, it's very clear that homosexuals historically have risen, in the ranks of warrior culture, have, demonstrated amazing abilities, have, proven themselves beyond the shadow of a doubt that they can be warriors, eye to eye, neck and neck with any other, straight man or woman. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I'll start this by asking you one question. And all of these individuals that you've heard about, what was the first thing that was said? Was it about their sexual orientation or, say, how many people they bested in a battle?
Usually it's immediately their sexual orientation. People can't seem to look past that.
Really?
Yes.
Well, that's a thing in Japanese culture especially. So looking at 3 specific heroes of warrior culture, one of them would be Minamoto Yoshitsune, who was a gentleman, a samurai of high rank who had several brothers who tried to kill him and do away with him. He had other family members that were after him. He evaded them. Supposedly was taught by the mythical Tengu, the ninja guys the legends are very interesting about him. And then there's another gentleman who's kind of related to him. His name would be Benke, would be the short one that people could look up and easily find. He would be Sohe, or warrior monk, who at one time was guarding a bridge, and Minamoto Yoshitsune was passing by, and this big, he's supposedly a very big guy, Benke, was guarding this bridge and said, I'm charging for tolls, you can best me or, pay the toll. And he had a collection of swords of all the people that he beat. And Beneke was known to have homosexual tendencies or has had lovers. Yoshitsune, there was that rumor. During the Satsuma time, again, going way, way later in time. So those two guys are in the Edo period. This is, woodblock prints, old style scrolls, that kind of stuff. Moving to the 1800s. In the Satsuma Rebellion, one of the, and I'm not going to give specific name right now because I can't remember, I remember his family name, but I wanted to get the individual. There was a leader of a band of samurai who were resisting the new government coming in that wanted to do away with the idea of the samurai and all of that. He was known to be a homosexual. However, this is also a man who fought numerous duels to the death and at one time stood before high-ranking military officials, took off his shirt, drew out his sword and said, I don't have any armor, who's going to fight me? But he was also well known to be a homosexual. But these things were always secondary. In his society, he's still sung of in a heroic way, and there's not even mention of that. But there's no, unlike with other heroes, there's no mention of him having hundreds of women, conquests and that kind of thing. They don't mythologize that. They just accept it as is and focus upon one thing. Sometimes it happens. Sometimes, like we said, it's mythologized that instead of being a homosexual, that this individual would have had some heterosexual conquest to make them look like a bigger warrior. Many times it's not done. Sometimes it is, but within specifically the Japanese culture, that wasn't done. It wasn't so much of an issue. It was accepted as a part of, that happened. It's how it is. It's not something to be ashamed of or have to hide. That's kind of a newer construct of American influence, I think, from when I'm there and I see this. It's changed a lot. Whereas, when older generations talk to me about it, whatever, it happens. It's no big deal. So it's very different, but that's not the defining feature. And how I see the differences between American culture and when I go to the UK and see friends, their culture, it's a very don't ask, don't tell, we don't know, we don't really care. And then when I go to Japan and speak with kind of the older generation, it's, yeah, whatever, it's okay, that's how it is. So culturally it's very different, very different.
And Hanjiro, I think it's important to point out that culturally, this is not something we talked today specifically about Japanese warrior culture and the Spartan warrior culture, but this is something that's seen worldwide. I mean, Northern Africa, the Middle East, even Celtic mythology, has stories, very similar to the Achilles story of the great warrior and his, fellow soldier lover. So looking at, folk tales and folklore and looking at actual historical records, this is nothing new. This is, pervasive, in almost every culture where there are warriors. You will see, warriors who have been homosexuals or have engaged in homosexual activity. And it doesn't detract in any way from, their ability to be effective in that role. So I think it's important for the tribe to understand that while this may be a prejudice that we all hold, maybe for different reasons, maybe, it's an ethical thing, a religious thing, or just you're not comfortable with it, it's important to recognize and to understand that this historically has happened and it is not detracted from the ability of warriors to be warriors.
Yeah, that's a great summation. It's looking at the continuation of human history. What are the two things that we've done? We've always had conflict between ourselves, and we've always had sexual identity, hence we procreate, hence we're alive now. So yeah, and if we were to be too much of one or too much of the other, we wouldn't exist anymore. Now, what are the things that shape it? Yeah, culture, society, religion, these things, and that's where we see the differences today. Like you said, North Africa and Middle East and Europe and East Asia, all of these places have long histories of warrior culture, but also with not so much written record of sexual culture or sexual identity, because it was just one of, like I said, there's not a whole litany of records as to how we went to the bathroom. There's not a whole litany of things of, how we ate. There is history of it. There's more history than that of how we went to the bathroom, but it's just about as much as, what our sexual lives were like. It's something that could be private or it could be public or it could be just not an issue. So yeah, it's very interesting of how and why these things live and exist and how it affects other things. But like you and I have discussed, that it's kind of secondary to the idea. If it breaks the group apart or if it divides, then we have to look at it. Is it something that is worthwhile investigating, and maybe it should divide us, or should it not divide us? I think you and I are both of the agreement that it's not something that needs to divide us. It's kind of secondary.
Yes, I mean, I agree with you. It is a secondary issue. It's a lifestyle issue. If we delve into, everybody's personal, moral or spiritual beliefs, then it may become a little bit trickier of a subject to discuss. But I think by and large in the tribe, it should be, pretty well established that individual sexuality, as long as it's, within the realms of what is legal, and morally, morality is a little touchier, but, I think it's safe to say that, we're going to look at legal sexual behavior as something that will not be divisive within the tribe.
Yeah, it's a great way of putting it, and that's something that brings up moral, legal, and ethical questions. Those things being defined and using the idea of just illegal. So right now it is illegal to have any kind of sexual interaction with children, and that's something personally I have looked into, and that's something culturally that's always been frowned upon with a good many long established warrior cultures. Children were sacrosanct, but then again, children, as we look at history, have never had a safer society or a safer time to grow up in than the present. And that's because we've given these safeguards of basically allowing them the time to grow and not be influenced by other things. So like war influence or military influence and sexual influence, to keep those things separate from childhood and let children have a childhood so that they don't grow up warped. This is something that not all cultures have done, and some cultures have. In the Spartan culture, it was early on that these children were basically put in a abusive situation. They were taught to be battered and to batter physically and everything else in order to survive. They're taught survival, and that's how they were taught. Within Japanese culture, it was a little bit different. Children were not put into that until a little bit older, and it was very regulated on how they did. Now, as far as the sexual part of it, that's not discussed as much, but there are two written records that I know of, one specifically that require that children be protected from all evil, or how do they say, changing or warping influences until 9 years of age. And that doesn't sound like much, but back in the day, I mean, you're practically a teenager at that point. So that's just one legal thing that I tend to agree with. And myself, being a victim of abuse when I was a child, it warped me. And a lot of people I've seen have that problem. So children need to be sacrosanct. That's completely separate of this argument or this discussion altogether. And I think every culture nowadays understands that we've come great distances as a society, right? We understand germ theory, what makes us sick. and we've come to understand that children are sacrosanct, like they need to be kept separate and protected so that they grow up to be not warped people so that they can help further us as a people. Unfortunately, not everybody in the world understands that, but I think as a whole, we're starting to understand that more. And that frame that away from this entire conversation. Like this is one thing that is outside of the discussion of sexuality and warrior culture. The other stuff of legality, there's different things that have moral and ethical implications.
Well, Hanjito, I want to thank you for being back on the show. Again, I look forward to being part of this series. I think this is going to go a long way to help members of the tribe and the greater listening audience to understand, some of the cultural and biological differences that we as individuals have, and putting that into the bigger context of warriorship and how it affects our ability to be effective in that role. So, Hanjito, thank you again for being on, and we look forward to having you on for the next episode.
Yeah, it's always good to talk, and like you said, continuing series to do two things. One, talk about this, but let's not forget to invite all of the tribe and all of those who wish to be a part of the tribe to calmly and rationally, because these are sometimes divisive, calmly and rationally get in touch and further the discussion and help us grow and understand these things as we come together as a tribe.